There are moments in life when a single act of disrespect becomes the thread that unravels an entire tapestry of lies. This is the story of how one woman's quiet dignity collided with a waiter's arrogance, and how that collision set off a chain of events that would expose corruption, destroy reputations, and ultimately reveal that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales when we least expect it. It began on an ordinary Tuesday evening in a restaurant where golden lights flickered against mahogany walls, where the scent of expensive wine mingled with the aroma of grilled steaks, and where my family and I walked through those doors, expecting nothing more than a pleasant dinner to celebrate my daughter's acceptance into medical school. What we received instead was humiliation served cold on a silver platter, but what I delivered in return would shake the foundations of that establishment and everyone connected to it. This is not just a story about revenge. It is a story about justice, about family honor, and about how sometimes the smallest sparks can ignite the largest fires. My name is Margaret Chen, and I have spent 43 years on this earth learning that respect is earned through hard work, kindness, and treating others the way you wish to be treated. I raised my daughter Emma as a single mother after my husband Daniel died in a construction accident when she was only 7 years old. For 16 years, I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3 during the holidays, cleaning office buildings at night, and working as a cashier at the grocery store during the day. Every dollar I earned went toward keeping our small apartment warm, putting food on our table, and most importantly, saving for Emma's education. She never asked for fancy clothes or expensive toys. She understood from a young age that we had to sacrifice today for a better tomorrow. When that acceptance letter from the state medical school arrived in our mailbox, I held it in my trembling hands and cried for 20 minutes straight. My baby girl, my Emma, was going to become a doctor. All those years of struggle, all those sleepless nights, all those moments when I wondered if I could keep going, they had all led to this beautiful moment. My sister, Linda, insisted that we celebrate properly. She had married well, and her husband Robert owned a successful accounting firm downtown. They had always been generous with us, helping with Emma's tutoring expenses and buying her a laptop when she started high school. Linda made reservations at Marcello's, the most prestigious Italian restaurant in our city, a place where businessmen made deals over $30 pasta dishes, and where the wine list was thicker than most novels. I initially protested because I knew the prices would be astronomical, but Linda would not hear any objections. She said this was a milestone that deserved to be celebrated in style, and that she and Robert would cover the entire bill. Emma deserved to feel special, to be treated like the accomplished young woman she had become. So I agreed, and we dressed in our nicest clothes. I wore the navy blue dress I had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago and had saved for special occasions. Emma wore a simple cream-colored blouse and black slacks that Linda had given her for Christmas. We were not dripping in designer labels, but we were clean, presentable, and filled with joy as we walked through those heavy wooden doors into Marcello's. The hostess greeted us with a professional smile and checked our reservation. She led us through the main dining room where chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen. I noticed the other diners, men in expensive suits, women wearing jewelry that probably cost more than my annual salary, everyone speaking in hushed tones as soft classical music played in the background. We were seated at a table near the back, close to the kitchen doors, which I found a bit odd since Linda had made the reservation 2 weeks in advance. Linda and Robert arrived shortly after, and soon our small family was together, studying the leather-bound menus and marveling at the descriptions of dishes with Italian names I could barely pronounce. Linda ordered a bottle of champagne despite my protests, saying that medical school acceptance only happens once in a lifetime. Emma's face glowed with happiness as she talked about her dreams of becoming a pediatrician, of helping children who came from difficult circumstances like she had. I felt my heart swelling with pride, thinking about how far we had come from those dark days after Daniel's death. Our waiter approached the table with an expression that I can only describe as barely concealed disdain. His name tag read Brandon, and he was a young man in his late 20s with slicked back hair and a sharp jawline that he held at an angle suggesting he thought quite highly of himself. He did not greet us warmly or introduce himself. Instead, he stood at the end of our table with his order pad and said in a flat tone that he would be serving us tonight. Linda, always gracious, smiled at him and asked for his recommendations. Brandon glanced at her diamond bracelet, and then his eyes swept over me and Emma with an expression that made my skin prickle. He rattled off the most expensive items on the menu in a bored voice, never making eye contact with me or my daughter. When Emma asked a question about whether a particular pasta dish contained nuts because she had a mild allergy, Brandon sighed audibly and said the kitchen could accommodate, but it would take extra time. The way he said it made it sound like Emma was being unreasonable for having an allergy. Robert ordered an appetizer and entrees for everyone, trying to keep the mood light and celebratory. When the champagne arrived, Brandon poured it carelessly, filling Linda's and Robert's glasses properly but barely putting any in mine and Emma's glasses before moving away. Linda frowned and called him back, pointing out that our glasses were only a quarter full. Brandon returned with the bottle and filled them properly, but I saw him roll his eyes as he turned away. That small gesture, that tiny roll of his eyes, struck something deep inside me. I have endured many indignities in my life. I have scrubbed toilets in office buildings while men in suits walked past me as if I were invisible. I have counted pennies at the grocery store checkout while people behind me in line tapped their feet impatiently. I have worn the same winter coat for 8 years because I could not afford a new one, but I have always maintained my dignity. I have always held my head high because I knew I was working honestly, providing for my daughter, and harming no one. To be treated with such blatant disrespect in front of my family on what should have been one of the happiest nights of my life felt like a slap across the face. The appetizers arrived and Brandon practically threw the plates onto the table, causing the bruschetta to slide to one side. He did not ask if we needed anything else or if everything was satisfactory. He simply walked away, and I noticed him stop at a nearby table where a couple dressed in obviously expensive clothing sat. His entire demeanor changed. He smiled, laughed at something the man said, and attended to them with the kind of care and attention we had not received. Linda noticed too, and her expression darkened. She whispered to Robert that the service was unacceptable and that she was going to speak to the manager, but I touched her arm and shook my head. I did not want to cause a scene. I did not want anything to ruin Emma's celebration. So we ate our appetizers and tried to focus on the conversation, on Emma's plans for medical school, on the bright future that lay ahead. But the joy had been tainted. That waiter had taken something precious from this evening, and I felt anger beginning to simmer beneath my calm exterior. When Brandon returned with our entrees, the situation grew worse. He placed Linda's and Robert's plates down gently, describing each dish as he did so. When he got to me and Emma, he put the plates down with noticeable thuds and said nothing. Emma's pasta was clearly the wrong dish. She had ordered the penne with marinara sauce, but this was spaghetti with meat sauce. When she politely pointed this out, Brandon huffed and said he had written down exactly what she ordered, and that maybe she had not been paying attention when she spoke. My daughter's face flushed red with embarrassment. Before I could say anything, Robert spoke up firmly, telling Brandon that Emma had definitely ordered the penne, and that he remembered it clearly. Brandon snatched the plate away with such force that some of the sauce splattered onto the white tablecloth. He muttered something under his breath as he walked away. I could not make out the exact words, but I heard cheap and doesn't belong, and my hands clenched into fists under the table. Linda was furious now and insisted on speaking to management immediately. Robert signaled to another waiter and asked for the manager. While we waited, I looked around the restaurant and noticed something peculiar. Brandon was not just rude to us, he seemed to have a pattern. He was attentive and charming to well-dressed customers, but dismissive and cold to anyone who did not meet his standards of appearance or perceived wealth. There was an elderly couple at a corner table who received the same poor treatment, and a young man dining alone who Brandon barely acknowledged. It was clear that this waiter had decided who was worthy of his time and effort based entirely on superficial judgments. It made me wonder how many other people had been treated this way, how many other special occasions had been ruined by his arrogance. The manager arrived, a portly man in his 50s named Vincent Marcello, and based on his surname and the way he carried himself, I assumed he was the owner. He listened to Linda's complaint with a concerned expression, nodding and apologizing profusely. He said Brandon was normally one of their best waiters, and this behavior was completely unacceptable. He offered to comp our entire meal and bring us complimentary desserts. It was a generous gesture, but it felt hollow because I could see in Vincent's eyes that he did not really believe us, or perhaps he simply did not care. He called Brandon over and spoke to him briefly in Italian, and I saw Brandon nod with a chastened expression that looked completely fake. Vincent assured us the rest of our evening would be perfect and hurried away to attend to other tables. Brandon returned with Emma's correct pasta dish, and suddenly he was all smiles and politeness, but it was so obviously an act that it made my stomach turn. We finished our meal in relative peace, but the damage had been done. What should have been a joyful celebration felt strained and uncomfortable. That night I could not sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that dinner in my mind. Emma had tried to brush it off, saying that some people were just rude and it was not worth dwelling on, but I could see in her eyes that she had been hurt. My daughter had worked so hard, overcome so many obstacles, and she deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. I thought about all the times in my life when I had been looked down upon, when people had made assumptions about me based on my worn clothes or my tired face. I had always turned the other cheek, always told myself that their opinions did not matter. But this felt different. This was not about me. It was about my child. And suddenly I realized that by always staying silent, by always accepting poor treatment without protest, I had perhaps been teaching Emma the wrong lesson. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. Sometimes you have to fight back. The next morning I called Linda and asked her for the name of the restaurant again and any other information she had about it. She was surprised by my interest and asked what I was planning. I told her honestly that I did not know yet, but that I could not let what happened slide. Linda understood. She had seen the hurt in Emma's eyes too. She told me that Marcello's had been in business for about 15 years and was considered one of the finest establishments in the city. Vincent Marcello was well connected in the local business community and had a reputation for running a tight ship. Linda also mentioned that Robert's firm had actually done some consulting work for Marcello's a few years ago, just basic tax preparation and financial advice, nothing major. That piece of information stuck in my mind, though I was not sure why at the time. I spent my lunch break at the grocery store searching for information about Marcello's on my phone. The restaurant had a beautiful website with professional photos of dishes and glowing reviews. Their social media pages were filled with pictures of happy customers and posts about their commitment to excellence and hospitality. I scrolled through hundreds of reviews and found that most were positive, praising the food quality and ambience. But as I dug deeper, I found scattered complaints similar to what we had experienced. Several reviewers mentioned poor service, particularly from a waiter they described as rude and judgmental. A few people specifically mentioned being treated differently based on how they were dressed. One review from a woman said she had been celebrating her anniversary, and the waiter made her feel so uncomfortable that she cried in the bathroom. These reviews were not the majority, and they were often buried under positive ones, but they were there. A pattern was emerging. I thought about simply leaving my own negative review and moving on, but I knew that would accomplish nothing. One more complaint lost in a sea of feedback would not change anything. Brandon would continue treating people poorly, and Vincent would continue running his restaurant, and the cycle would repeat. I needed something more substantial. As I restocked shelves that afternoon, my mind kept working on the problem. What bothered me most was Vincent's reaction. He had been apologetic, but I sensed he was just going through the motions. He offered a free meal but never really addressed the core issue. It made me wonder if he actually condoned this behavior, if perhaps he had instructed his staff to prioritize wealthy-looking customers because they were more likely to order expensive items and leave big tips. That evening, I did something I had never done before. I created a fake email account and sent a detailed message to the city's health department and business licensing board. I described our experience at Marcello's, but I also mentioned that I had noticed some things that seemed unusual during our visit. The table near the kitchen, where we were seated, felt cooler than the rest of the restaurant, suggesting possible issues with temperature control for food storage areas near the kitchen. I mentioned that I had seen Brandon handle our food without changing gloves between different tables. I noted that the restaurant seemed unusually eager to comp our meal, which made me wonder if they were trying to avoid official complaints. None of these observations were lies. They were things I had genuinely noticed, but I presented them in a way that would trigger an inspection. I felt a small twinge of guilt as I hit send, but I reminded myself that if Marcello's was running a clean, honest operation, they had nothing to fear from an inspection. Over the next few days, I could not stop thinking about the restaurant. It had become something of an obsession. I found myself looking up everything I could find about Vincent Marcello. He had started the restaurant 15 years ago after working as a chef in several other establishments. He was married with 2 teenage children and lived in an upscale neighborhood across town. He belonged to the local Chamber of Commerce and had been featured in several newspaper articles about successful small business owners. On the surface, he seemed like an upstanding member of the community, but I kept coming back to that moment when he spoke to Brandon in Italian. There had been something in his tone, in the way Brandon responded, that suggested a deeper understanding between them. It was as if Vincent was not really reprimanding him, but rather reminding him to be more careful. Linda called me 2 weeks after our dinner at Marcello's with interesting news. She said Robert had mentioned that when his firm did work for the restaurant years ago, there had been some irregularities in the books that had made him uncomfortable. Nothing he could prove, or that rose to the level of obvious fraud, but things that did not quite add up. Robert had raised his concerns with Vincent at the time, and Vincent had provided explanations that were technically plausible but felt evasive. After completing that year's taxes, Robert had politely declined to continue working with Marcello's, saying his firm was taking on fewer clients. The truth was he had not wanted to be associated with what his instincts told him was a questionable operation. Linda said Robert would never say anything publicly because he had no concrete evidence, and because making accusations against a business owner could result in a lawsuit. But privately, he had always wondered if Marcello's was engaged in some form of financial manipulation. This information energized me in a way I had not felt in years. I realized that my instincts had been correct. There was something wrong with that restaurant beyond just poor customer service. I started researching common types of restaurant fraud and discovered a world I had never known existed. Restaurants could manipulate their books in dozens of ways. They could underreport cash sales to avoid taxes. They could create fake vendor invoices and pocket the money. They could engage in credit card fraud by running cards for larger amounts than the actual bill. They could exploit workers by paying them under the table and avoiding employment taxes. The possibilities were endless and apparently quite common in the industry. I began spending every spare moment conducting what I suppose could be called an amateur investigation. I visited Marcello's website again and noticed they advertised accepting both cash and credit cards, but encouraged cash payments by offering a small discount. That was a classic red flag for tax evasion. I looked up their business filings with the state and found that they reported relatively modest profits each year, which seemed strange for a restaurant that was always busy and charged premium prices. I checked to see if they had any violations on record with health departments or employment agencies, and found a couple of minor infractions over the years. Nothing major, but enough to suggest they were not as immaculate as they portrayed themselves. Then I did something bold. I applied for a job at Marcello's. I used a different name on the application, called myself Margaret Liu instead of Margaret Chen, and said I was looking for part-time evening work as a dishwasher or kitchen assistant. I knew I would never be hired as wait staff because of my age and appearance. I was exactly the type of person Brandon would sneer at, but restaurants always needed kitchen help, and turnover in those positions was high. I submitted my application online and was surprised to receive a call the very next day asking me to come in for an interview. I told my supervisor at the grocery store that I needed a few hours off for a family matter and drove to Marcello's during the afternoon when they were preparing for dinner service. The interview was conducted by a harried kitchen manager named Carlos who barely looked at my resume. He asked if I could work nights, if I had any health conditions that would prevent me from standing for long periods, and if I could start immediately. I said yes to all three questions. He hired me on the spot at minimum wage, paid in cash at the end of each week, no contract, no benefits, no official paperwork. He told me to come in that evening at 4 o'clock, and someone would show me the ropes. As I left that interview, I felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I now had inside access to Marcello's, but I also had committed to working essentially 3 jobs because I could not afford to quit my day positions. I would be exhausted, but I told myself it would be worth it if I could find evidence of wrongdoing. Working in the kitchen at Marcello's was a revelation. The restaurant that presented such an elegant face to its customers was a chaotic, often unsanitary operation behind the scenes. The kitchen was cramped and poorly ventilated. During busy dinner rushes, the heat was unbearable and the shouting never stopped. Carlos barked orders at the line cooks who in turn yelled at each other and at people like me who were at the bottom of the hierarchy. I spent my shifts washing dishes, scrubbing pots, and occasionally helping with basic food prep. It was hard physical labor, and after my first week I had burns on my hands from the hot water and aching feet from standing on concrete floors. But I kept my head down, did my work, and most importantly, kept my eyes and ears open. Within days, I started noticing things that confirmed my suspicions. The kitchen staff was a mix of documented and undocumented workers, and Vincent clearly took advantage of those who were undocumented by paying them even less than the meager wages he gave the rest of us and threatening to report them if they complained. I witnessed him berating a young man from El Salvador who asked about getting paid for overtime hours, telling him he was lucky to have a job at all, and that if he did not like the conditions he could leave. Food safety practices were inconsistent at best. I saw chicken stored at improper temperatures, salad ingredients washed in the same sink where pots were cleaned, and employees handling food after smoking cigarettes without washing their hands. When a health inspector did arrive, apparently in response to a complaint someone had filed, Vincent was tipped off in advance, and the entire staff spent a day deep cleaning and fixing violations before the inspector showed up. Everything looked perfect during the inspection, and we passed with flying colors. But the most interesting discoveries were financial. I noticed that Vincent had 2 different sets of receipts for some supplies. One set showed the actual amount paid, while another set showed inflated amounts. I realized he was using the inflated receipts for his business tax returns to claim higher expenses and lower profits while pocketing the difference. I also noticed that many customers paid in cash, and those transactions were often not entered into the official register. Vincent would take cash payments personally, and I watched him pocket a portion of that money before recording a smaller amount in the books. On busy Friday and Saturday nights, hundreds or even thousands of dollars were simply disappearing without being reported as income. I befriended a waitress named Maria who had worked at Marcello's for 3 years. She was a hardworking single mother like me, and we bonded over shared struggles. During our breaks, Maria would tell me about life in the front of the house. She confirmed that Brandon was Vincent's nephew, and that was why he was never fired despite numerous customer complaints. Brandon had been given the best sections of the restaurant and was allowed to treat customers however he wanted because family loyalty trumped everything else. Maria also told me that the wait staff was required to share tips with the kitchen staff, which was legal, but Vincent took a cut of those pooled tips as a management fee, which was definitely not legal. The servers were too afraid to report him because most of them needed the job desperately, and Vincent had made it clear that anyone who caused trouble would be blacklisted from working at any restaurant in the city because of his connections. One evening about 3 weeks into my time at Marcello's, I was taking out the trash to the dumpster in the back alley when I overheard Vincent on his phone. He was speaking in Italian, but I had been listening to enough Italian in the kitchen that I could pick up certain words. He was talking about money, about moving money, and about someone coming to take care of things at the end of the month. His tone was urgent and secretive. When he finished the call and went back inside, I stood in that alley feeling my heart race. I was certain now that Vincent was involved in something more than just skimming cash and fudging expense reports. This sounded like something bigger, possibly connected to organized crime or money laundering. I knew I needed concrete evidence if I wanted anyone to take my claims seriously. I started bringing a small camera to work, one of those tiny devices you can buy online for home security. During my shifts, whenever I was alone or relatively unobserved, I would take pictures of documents left out on desks, of the 2 sets of receipts, of the poor food storage conditions, of anything that might be useful. It was risky, and my hands shook every time I pulled out that camera, but I felt driven by a sense of purpose I had not experienced since Emma was born. This was no longer just about getting revenge on a rude waiter. This was about exposing corruption, about protecting workers who were being exploited, about ensuring that a dishonest business owner faced consequences for his actions. Maria became an unwitting ally in my investigation. She would complain to me about various problems at the restaurant, and I would ask careful questions that led her to reveal more information. Through our conversations, I learned that Vincent had been cutting corners more and more over the past few years. The restaurant was not as profitable as it used to be because competition had increased in the area, so Vincent was resorting to increasingly questionable methods to maintain his lifestyle. Maria mentioned that several employees had been injured on the job due to unsafe conditions, but were pressured to not file workers' compensation claims. She told me about a cook who had suffered a severe burn, and Vincent paid him a few $100s in cash to forget about it rather than report it officially. I also started documenting my own experiences as an employee. I kept detailed notes of my hours worked, the wages I received, and the conditions in the kitchen. Vincent was paying me and several others completely under the table, providing no pay stubs, no documentation, nothing that would create a paper trail. This meant he was avoiding payroll taxes, unemployment insurance, and all the other legal obligations employers have. It also meant that workers like me had no protection, no recourse if we were injured or treated unfairly. I was keeping track of everything because I knew it would be important when the time came to build a case against him. Then I got lucky. One night Vincent left his office door open while he went to deal with a problem in the dining room. I was walking past with a stack of clean plates and I glanced inside. On his desk was a ledger, an old-fashioned actual book where he was apparently keeping his real financial records. It was open to a page showing cash receipts that were significantly higher than what I had seen him enter into the computer. My heart pounding, I quickly set down the plates, pulled out my camera, and snapped several photos of the ledger pages. I could hear Vincent's voice in the distance, getting closer. I slipped the camera back into my pocket, grabbed the plates, and hurried away just as he returned to his office. He never knew I had been there. Over the following weeks, I continued gathering evidence whenever opportunities presented themselves. I photographed the falsified invoices from vendors, showing that Vincent claimed to pay certain suppliers much more than he actually did. I documented instances of cash payments being pocketed. I recorded conversations on my phone where Vincent made threats to employees or discussed his schemes with his cousin, who apparently helped him manipulate the books. I was building a comprehensive case that painted a picture of a restaurant engaged in systematic fraud on multiple levels. Maintaining 3 jobs while conducting this secret investigation took a tremendous toll on me. I was getting only 4 or 5 hours of sleep each night. I would work at the grocery store during the day, rush home to change, then work at Marcello's in the evening, and several nights a week I still had my overnight office cleaning job. Emma noticed I was exhausted and pale. She begged me to quit one of the jobs, saying we could make do with less income now that she had received some scholarship money for medical school. But I could not explain to her what I was really doing. I could not tell her that I was infiltrating a corrupt restaurant as part of an elaborate plan to expose the owner and get revenge for how we had been treated. It sounded crazy, even in my own head. Linda was the only person who knew the full extent of what I was doing. I had confided in her after the first week working at Marcello's, and while she was worried about the risks I was taking, she also understood why I felt compelled to do this. She made me promise to be careful and to not do anything that would put me in physical danger. I assured her that I was just observing and documenting, not confronting anyone or stealing anything. Still, I could see the concern in her eyes every time we spoke. She thought I was becoming obsessed, and maybe she was right. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about Vincent and Brandon, imagining the moment when they would be exposed and held accountable. The desire for justice had consumed me in a way that was probably not healthy, but I could not stop myself. The strain began affecting my relationship with Emma. She was preparing to start medical school in a few months and needed her mother's support and attention, but I was distracted and tired all the time. We had a fight one evening when she asked me to help her shop for supplies she would need for school, and I snapped at her because I was stressed about an upcoming shift at Marcello's, where I planned to search Vincent's office more thoroughly. Emma was hurt and confused by my reaction. She said I had been acting strange for weeks, and she did not understand what was wrong. I apologized and tried to explain that I was just overwhelmed with work, but I could see she did not fully believe me. The guilt I felt was crushing. Here I was, supposedly doing all of this to defend my daughter's honor, but in the process I was neglecting her and damaging our relationship. During my 10th week at Marcello's, something happened that nearly derailed everything. I was in the kitchen late one evening, after most of the staff had left, photographing some documents I had found in a filing cabinet. I thought I was alone, but suddenly Carlos walked in to retrieve something he had forgot. He saw me with my camera pointed at papers that were spread on a counter. For a moment, we both froze. Then Carlos asked me what I was doing. My mind raced for an explanation. I told him I was taking pictures of recipes because I was hopping to learn to cook better at home and thought I could study the restaurant's techniques. It was a weak lie, and I expected him not to believe it. But Carlos just shrugged and said that if Vincent caught me taking pictures of anything, I would be fired immediately. He grabbed what he had come for and left without saying anything else. My legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down. That close call made me realize I needed to finish my investigation soon. I had been working at Marcello's for more than 2 months and had collected a substantial amount of evidence. I had photos of falsified documents, recordings of incriminating conversations, detailed notes about unsafe working conditions and labor violations, and records of my own off-the-books employment. I had everything I needed to make a compelling case. Now I had to decide what to do with this information. I could go to the police, but I was not sure if what I had documented rose to the level of criminal fraud or if it would just be treated as a civil matter. I could contact the IRS, which would certainly be interested in tax evasion, but I had heard their investigations could take years. I could go to the media, but I was not sure any reporter would take me seriously without corroboration from official sources. After much deliberation, I decided on a multi-pronged approach. I would submit anonymous tips to every relevant authority simultaneously, providing them with copies of all my evidence. That way, even if one agency did not act quickly, others might, and the cumulative pressure would make it impossible for Vincent to escape scrutiny. I created a new email address that could not be traced back to me and spent an entire weekend organizing my evidence into clear, well-documented packages. I wrote detailed explanations of what each piece of evidence showed and how it fit into the larger pattern of fraud and misconduct. I made sure to present everything in a professional, factual manner, avoiding emotional language or personal attacks. I wanted the authorities to take me seriously. My first email went to the Internal Revenue Service with a comprehensive outline of the tax evasion I had witnessed. I explained the dual record-keeping system, the unreported cash income, the falsified expense reports, and the off-the-books payroll. I provided photos of the relevant documents and offered to make myself available for an interview if they needed more information, though I did not reveal my identity. The IRS has a whistleblower program that rewards people who report tax fraud, but I did not care about any potential reward. I just wanted Vincent to face consequences. My second email went to the State Labor Department detailing the wage violations, the unsafe working conditions, the lack of proper employment documentation, and the intimidation of workers who tried to assert their rights. I included testimony from my own experience working there and mentioned that many other employees would likely come forward if they were assured protection from retaliation. I attached photos showing the dangerous kitchen conditions and the evidence of under-the-table payments. My third email went to the health department with documentation of the food safety violations I had observed. I knew they had already conducted one inspection and found nothing, but I explained that the restaurant had been tipped off in advance and had cleaned up specifically for that visit. I provided dates and times of specific violations I had witnessed and suggested they conduct a surprise inspection to see the real conditions. My fourth email went to the City Business Licensing Board outlining how Marcello's was operating in violation of various business regulations. I noted that they were employing people without proper documentation, that they were not maintaining accurate records as required by law, and that they had created an unsafe environment for both workers and customers. Finally, I sent a detailed package to the local newspaper's investigative reporting team. I had researched which journalists covered business corruption and found a reporter named Sarah Mitchell who had won awards for exposing fraud in local companies. I sent her everything I had sent to the government agencies, along with a narrative explaining how I had discovered all of this information. I told her the story of my dinner at Marcello's, how I had been treated poorly by Brandon, and how that experience had led me down a rabbit hole of discovering systemic corruption. I thought the human interest angle might appeal to her and make her more likely to investigate the story. After I sent the final email, I sat back in my chair and felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety wash over me. I had done it. I had taken all the evidence I had risked so much to gather and put it in the hands of people who had the power to do something about it. Now all I could do was wait and see if anyone would take action. I had no idea how long it might take, or if anything would even come of my reports. Government agencies were slow and bureaucratic. The newspaper might decide the story was not interesting enough to pursue. Vincent might have connections that would protect him. There were so many ways this could fail to produce the results I hoped for. I quit my job at Marcello's the next day. I simply did not show up for my shift and did not answer when Carlos called to ask where I was. I had already been paid for the previous week, and I had no intention of ever setting foot in that restaurant again. I worried that Carlos might have mentioned seeing me with the camera to Vincent, and that if I stayed any longer, I might be confronted or worse. It felt good to walk away, but also anticlimactic. After all those weeks of intense investigation, it just ended with me ghosting them like any other minimum wage worker who had decided the job was not worth it. The days that followed were agonizing. I kept checking my email obsessively to see if any of the authorities had responded, but there was only silence. I searched online for any news about Marcello's but found nothing. Life went on as normal for everyone else while I felt like I was holding my breath waiting for something to happen. I went to my job at the grocery store and tried to focus on stocking shelves and ringing up customers, but my mind was always elsewhere. At night, I lay awake wondering if I had made a mistake, if my evidence had not been compelling enough, if I had wasted months of my life on a quest for justice that would never materialize. Emma noticed I seemed more relaxed despite still being tired. I had stopped working at Marcello's, which gave me back some time and reduced my stress levels slightly. She asked me directly one evening if something had been going on that she should know about. I almost told her everything but decided against it. If nothing came of my investigation, there was no point in worrying her. If something did happen, she would find out soon enough. So I just hugged her and said I had been dealing with some personal issues that were now resolved, and that I was sorry for being so distant lately. She accepted this explanation, and we spent a nice evening together planning her move to the city where medical school was located and talking about her dreams for the future. 2 weeks after I sent the anonymous tips, I finally got a response. It came not from any government agency but from Sarah Mitchell, the investigative journalist at the newspaper. She sent an email to my anonymous address saying she had received my tip and found it very interesting. She had done some preliminary research and confirmed that Marcello's had several red flags in its business filings that supported my allegations. She wanted to pursue the story, but needed to verify my evidence. She asked if I would be willing to meet with her in person, with full confidentiality and protection of my identity as a source. She explained that she could not run a story based solely on anonymous tips and that she would need to conduct her own investigation, but having an inside source would be invaluable. I was terrified at the prospect of meeting with a journalist in person. Everything I had done up to this point had been from behind the safety of anonymity. Meeting someone face to face meant exposing myself, creating the possibility that my identity could somehow leak out. But I also knew that if I wanted this story to actually get published and have an impact, I needed to work with Sarah. After agonizing over the decision for a day, I replied to her email agreeing to meet but insisting on strict conditions. We would meet in a public place far from my neighborhood. I would not provide my real name, and she would not record our conversation or take any photos. She agreed to all my terms, and we set up a meeting for the following Saturday at a coffee shop in a part of the city I rarely visited. Sarah Mitchell turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a kind demeanor. She arrived at the coffee shop exactly on time carrying a leather bag that probably contained notebooks and files. I had gotten there early and chosen a table in the back corner where we could talk without being easily overheard. When she approached and asked if I was the person she was meeting, I nodded nervously. She sat down across from me and immediately thanked me for agreeing to meet. She said she could tell I was putting myself at risk by coming forward, and she appreciated my courage. Her words made me feel slightly less terrified. We spent 2 hours at that coffee shop and I told her everything. I explained how my family had been treated at Marcello's, how that experience had motivated me to investigate, how I had gotten a job there and spent weeks gathering evidence. I walked her through all the fraud I had discovered, the tax evasion, the labor violations, the unsafe conditions, the falsified documents. Sarah took notes by hand as I spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting more details about specific incidents. She was professional and non-judgmental, never making me feel like what I had done was crazy or excessive. Instead, she treated me like a valuable source, providing important information about criminal activity. When I finished my story, Sarah sat back and let out a low whistle. She said that if even half of what I had told her could be verified, this was a significant story about systemic corruption in a prominent local business. She explained that she would need to conduct her own independent investigation to corroborate my claims, because journalists could not simply take a source's word for things, even when that source provided evidence. She would need to request official records, interview other employees if possible, and try to get responses from Vincent and Brandon. This process would take time, possibly weeks or even months, but she promised me that she would pursue the story diligently and that my identity would be protected. Under state law, journalists had the right to refuse to reveal their sources, and she would go to jail before she gave up my name if it came to that. I provided Sarah with copies of all my evidence on a USB drive. I had made multiple copies and stored them in different locations in case anything happened to one of them. Sarah examined some of the photos and documents on her laptop right there in the coffee shop, and her expression grew more serious as she scrolled through them. She said the evidence was strong and detailed, much more thorough than what most sources provided. She asked if I had sent this information to any law enforcement agencies, and I told her about the emails to the IRS, Labor Department, Health Department, and Business Licensing Board. Sarah nodded approvingly and said that the involvement of government investigators would strengthen her story and vice versa. The newspaper's coverage would put pressure on officials to take action, and any official actions would provide her with additional documentation and confirmation for her reporting. Before we parted ways, Sarah asked me one more question. She wanted to know what I ultimately hoped would come from all of this. Was I looking for revenge against Brandon and Vincent? Was I trying to get some kind of financial compensation? Or was there something else driving me? I thought about her question carefully before answering. I told her that when I started this, it had been about anger and hurt pride, and wanting to make the people who disrespected my family pay a price for their behavior. But as I uncovered more and more evidence of fraud and exploitation, my motivations had evolved. Yes, I still wanted Brandon and Vincent to face consequences for how they treated people, but I also wanted justice for all the workers who had been exploited, for all the customers who had been served food in unsafe conditions, for all the taxpayers whose money had been stolen through evasion. This had become bigger than my personal grievance. It had become about doing what was right. 6 weeks after my meeting with Sarah Mitchell, her article was published on the front page of the newspaper's Sunday edition. The headline read, "Local restaurant owner accused of systematic fraud, labor violations." The story was long and detailed, taking up nearly an entire page, plus a continuation inside. Sarah had done an incredible job investigating and corroborating everything I had told her. She had obtained business records through public records requests that showed discrepancies in Marcello's reported income. She had found and interviewed 3 former employees who confirmed the labor violations and unsafe working conditions. She had gotten an expert in restaurant finances to review the evidence I had provided, and that expert stated on the record that it appeared to show a pattern of tax evasion and fraud. She had even managed to get responses from Vincent and Brandon, both of whom denied any wrongdoing and claimed they were being targeted by a disgruntled former employee who was lying. The article included several of the photos I had taken, though they were cropped and edited to remove any identifying information about me. There were pictures of the falsified invoices, of the dual record-keeping system, of the unsafe food storage conditions. Sarah had also included the story of my family's dinner at Marcello's and how we had been treated, though she did not use any of our real names or identify us specifically. She framed it as an example of how the restaurant's culture of discrimination and poor service extended from ownership down through staff like Brandon. The article was damning and thorough, leaving little doubt that something seriously wrong was happening at Marcello's. The reaction was immediate and intense. Within hours of the article being published, it was being shared thousands of times on social media. People who had had bad experiences at Marcello's came forward with their own stories. Former employees started speaking publicly about the conditions they had endured. Local politicians who were always eager to jump on a scandal issued statements demanding investigations. The Restaurant Industry Association released a statement condemning any businesses that engaged in the practices described in the article. It was a firestorm of negative publicity that made it impossible for authorities to ignore what was happening. The health department conducted a surprise inspection of Marcello's 2 days after the article came out and found multiple violations serious enough to result in the restaurant being temporarily shut down until they were corrected. The state labor department opened an official investigation into the employment practices and wage violations. The IRS, while they would not comment publicly on whether they were investigating, made it clear through unofficial channels that they were very interested in the tax allegations. The City Business Licensing Board scheduled a hearing to determine if Marcello's license should be suspended or revoked. Suddenly, Vincent Marcello was facing potential legal trouble from multiple directions, and his reputation was in ruins. I watched all of this unfold from a distance with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. I had done this. My actions had set off this chain reaction that was now tearing apart Vincent's restaurant and exposing him as a fraud. Emma saw the article and knew immediately what must have happened. She confronted me that evening and demanded to know if I had been involved in this investigation. I could not lie to her anymore, so I admitted everything. I told her about working at Marcello's, about gathering evidence, about meeting with the journalist. Emma's reaction surprised me. She was not angry or disappointed. Instead, she was proud. She said she could not believe her mother had gone to such lengths to fight back against injustice and that I was braver than she had ever realized. She hugged me tightly and said she understood now why I had been so distant and stressed. She wished I had told her sooner so she could have supported me, but she understood why I had kept it secret. Linda and Robert were equally amazed when I told them the full story. Robert said his instincts about Marcello's questionable finances had been correct all along, and he wished he had pushed harder years ago to look into it. Linda was worried that Vincent might somehow figure out I had been behind the investigation and come after me, but I explained that I had been extremely careful to protect my anonymity. The journalist had never used my name, and I had used a fake identity while working at the restaurant. There was no paper trail connecting me to anything. As far as Vincent knew, Some anonymous whistleblower with access to his business had turned him in, but he had no way of knowing it was the woman from that dinner table he had barely noticed months ago. Over the following months, the legal troubles for Vincent Marcello intensified. The IRS investigation moved forward, and agents spent days at the restaurant going through records. Vincent hired an expensive lawyer who argued that any discrepancies in the books were honest mistakes or the result of poor bookkeeping rather than intentional fraud. But the evidence was too extensive and too clear. The pattern of dual records, unreported income, and falsified expenses showed obvious intent to deceive. In the end, Vincent was charged with multiple counts of tax evasion and faced both criminal penalties and massive back taxes, plus penalties and interest. The Labor Department investigation resulted in findings that Marcello's had systematically violated wage and hour laws, failed to maintain proper employment records, and created an unsafe work environment. The department issued tens of thousands of dollars in fines and ordered Vincent to pay back wages to numerous employees who had been cheated. Several former workers, emboldened by the publicity and assured that they now had protection, came forward with complaints that resulted in additional penalties. Vincent tried to settle these cases quietly, but the amounts kept piling up until they threatened to bankrupt him. The health department shut down Marcello's for 3 weeks to allow for corrections of all the violations they found. When the restaurant finally reopened, it was under a probationary status that required frequent inspections, but the damage to its reputation was severe. Customers stayed away in droves. No one wanted to eat at a restaurant that had been exposed for unsafe food handling and corruption. Online review sites were flooded with one-star reviews and angry comments. The once prestigious establishment had become a pariah. Brandon, Vincent's nephew, became a particular target of public anger. Someone created a social media account dedicated to collecting stories of poor service at Marcello's, and Brandon was featured prominently in dozens of testimonials from people who said he had treated them terribly. The account went viral, and Brandon's name became synonymous with rude, discriminatory service. He was forced to delete all his personal social media accounts because of the harassment and hate messages he received. Vincent eventually fired him in an attempt to do damage control, but it was too little too late. The business was hemorrhaging money and drowning in legal fees. Sarah Mitchell won an award for her investigative reporting on Marcello's. Her editors gave her a bonus and a promotion. She wrote a follow-up article detailing the various legal consequences Vincent was facing and noting that the case had prompted several other restaurants in the area to suddenly become much more careful about their own practices. The story had sent shockwaves through the local restaurant industry and made it clear that fraud and exploitation would not be tolerated. Sarah reached out to me through our secure email channel to thank me again for coming forward and to tell me that I had made a real difference.